Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this FlaskUp.com Mists of Pandaria raiding guide. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the heroic mode version of the Spoils of Pandaria in the Siege of Orgrimmar raid. Now in order to complete this fight, you're going to want to bring 2 tanks, 2 healers, and then the remaining a mixture of both melee and ranged DPS. Now the majority of this fight is similar to the normal mode version of this encounter, so therefore we're not going to cover all of the abilities that have been pulled over. Instead, if you'd like to recap them, you can click on the link in the video description below to view our normal mode written guide. Now, like I've said, this fight is similar to the normal mode fight, and the main thing that stays the same is the fact you're going to need to split your raid group into 2 separate groups, and you need to have at least 1 tank and 1 healer in each group, and then obviously 3 DPS. We recommend 2 ranged and 1 melee, but if possible 3 ranged is always a bonus because melee aren't overly brilliant on this fight, unfortunately. Now in heroic mode there is one new ability that you're going to have to deal with, and this is called an unstable spark. And one of these unstable sparks will spawn in the opposite quadrant to what you're currently in. So if you're in Mogu, one will spawn in Manted, and if you're on Manted, one will spawn in Mogu, every time you kill off one of the crates. Now after a short duration of time, these sparks will cast an ability called Supernova, which will deal a very high amount of damage to anyone that's close to them, unless the spark is actually killed off. Now unfortunately you do need to kill off these sparks, and we're going to take a look at them a little bit later on in the guide. First of all, we're going to take a look at the Mogu and Manted section separately, and then we'll move on to take a look at what has changed and what you should mainly be aware of throughout this fight. So first of all, we're going to be taking a look at the Manted quadrant and what's changed and how to deal with it. Now when you first get into the room, you're going to want to start off by opening the 2 green Pandaren boxes, which will give you your 2 buffs, whether it be a tank buff, a healer buff, or a DPS buff. Remember, it's 2 at random. And then from there on, you're going to want to open 2 big boxes, 5 medium boxes, and 7 small boxes, which in turn will give you the 50 energy that you need in order to pull the lever in this quadrant and then move on to your next quadrant. The same also applies for Mogu, so I won't repeat that later on in the guide. Now what you'll probably notice in the Manted quadrant is that the healing requirement is probably slightly higher than the Mogu quadrant. And this is mainly because of the Pheromone Cloud ability, which is strangely an ability that was there in the normal mode version of the fight. However, it just didn't really do much damage, but now it is a matter of life or death to an extent, depending on how good your healers are really. Now this is ticking damage every second, and it will begin to hit very hard, especially if you don't kill off the Manted Commander, which is the boss which will be giving this debuff onto players. This is just something you've got to heal through, but you need to make sure that you aren't letting players get too low, and it could cause issues if you're running to one half of the quadrant in order to drop the bombs from the set to below debuff, and you've got this debuff on you. So you need to make sure that you're healed up before you're running away from your healers and not doing anything too stupid. Now speaking of the set to below debuff, this is got to be managed very well in the heroic mode, because the bombs will completely and utterly kill people if they happen to mess up and not place them, or if they happen to run into them. Now, you want to try and place these bombs in a faraway location as fast as you possibly can, so somewhere where your raid isn't going to be standing. And you want to try and do your best to make sure you're stacking them on top of each other, because that causes them to set off a chain reaction of explosions when the first one does blow up. You need to make sure that they are on top of each other with they have like a small circle around the initial bomb and then a bigger blast radius. You just need to make sure the bombs are within the blast radius, and you need to make sure yourself isn't running into the smaller circular bomb area, because that's when you will set them off and end up killing yourself. If you're at the point in the fight where you've just moved from the Mogu quadrant to the Manted quadrant, remember you can run back into the Mogu quadrant in order to drop the bombs from set to below, so that means that they're completely out of the way and they're not going to affect your raid in any way whatsoever. But be aware that the ticking damage from Pheromone Cloud will still hit you, so you need to make sure you do have some form of a personal cooldown or some kind of a hot running on you if you are going to end up running that far away from the entire raid. Now when it comes to the smaller mobs, you need to make sure you're watching out for the enrage buff that the Korthic Warcallers will place on themselves, as this will increase their damage by 200%, which is obviously a lot more in heroic mode, as they'll deal more actual damage, and they will also remove armor by 20% for every time they hit a target and apply a stack of a certain debuff to it. You just need to make sure that your tanks are a bit aware of this debuff and your raid kill off the Warcallers as fast as possible. And I think I'm right in saying that the enrage can be removed from the Warcaller, so by purging it or removing it using some form of an offensive dispel. You can also dispel the residue buff that the Amber Priests will place on an allied mob, and this is a spell that will heal them and other targets around them, and you don't really want this going off because stuff's more health and you've still got the same amount of time in order to get through that quadrant, so you don't want mobs to be healing, otherwise you're going to end up wasting time. And now moving on to the Mogu quadrant, and again, when you first get into this quadrant, whether it be at the start of the fight or after you've completed the Mantic quadrant, you'll want to open the 2 green Pandaria boxes and then get the buffs as soon as you can. Now in this quadrant, the main abilities that you're going to have to look out for are what come from the 4 different types of big adds that you can get, and this is the Strength of the Stone ability and the Return to Stone ability. Now if you remember, Return to Stone is what will be cast on players randomly, which will cause them to get knocked back and also spawn random Mogu stone statues. Now for every statue that is up, the big adds damage will be increased by 20% for every stone statue that is alive. So in heroic mode, obviously this damage is a hell of a lot more, and it's going to be hitting your raid a lot harder. I think when we were doing it, when we had the statues spawn and didn't get killed off, the big ad got us to around 25%, maybe 20 health. It's just something that you need to be aware of, because if you do have something else up at the same time as the big ad, which you shouldn't do really, then it could cause an awkward situation resulting in death. If you do happen to gain a healer buff from the green Pandaren crates that open up, then your healers can help the rest of your raid by positioning themselves in such a way that they deal damage to the stone statues, meaning that your DPS can just cleave them off, as they'll only have about 200,000 health left after the healer's wave of death has hit them, and then in turn the healers are going to have to do less healing, your raid's going to take less damage, because there won't be as many stone statues alive when he casts his big Doom ability. Again, the ability does depend on which of the 4 big adds it is that does spawn, but in turn all of the abilities work in the same way, they just have different names and slightly different animations. Now other than the big adds and the stone statues, the only other thing that might cause you some kind of issues in the Mogu quadrant is the burial urns. And this is because of the small sparks that they spawn and the pulsing AoE damage that they deal. Now, if you happen to open 2 small crates in succession and you get 2 burial urns, you're going to have a lot of the sparks spawning. But what you need to remember is that you don't actually kill these sparks, you kill off the burial urns, which will then stop them from spawning. This will cause positioning issues, there's no way to kind of avoid it, unfortunately. It's just based on the RNG gods and which small mob they decide to throw at you from the small crates. But if you do happen to get the burial urns twice, then just try and stay to the sides out the way and let the sparks just run around in the center of the room where you're not going to get hit by them. This is why bringing 3 ranged might help, especially for the unstable sparks that will be spawning from the other quadrant, because if you're all to the side of the room and these little sparks are going around dealing loads of damage, melee won't be able to go and hit those sparks, the unstable sparks. Not that they should anyway, but if you have 3 ranged, it means more people can actually switch and kill them off as fast as possible. This helps even more so if the Mantic quadrant is ahead and you've got quite a few of the unstable sparks spawning in your sector, and you need to kind of keep up with the damage on them. And now to finish off, we're going to talk a little bit more about the unstable sparks that will be spawning throughout the fight. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the guide, one of these sparks will spawn once all of the mobs from one of the boxes has been killed off. So if you get a small box with an urn spawning, once you kill off the urn, then a spark will spawn in the opposite quadrant. And you need to remember that the sparks will always spawn in the opposite quadrant. So if you're in Mogu, one will spawn in Mantid, and if you're in Mantid, one will spawn in Mogu. Now, the idea behind these sparks is that you need to keep control of them at all times, and the best way for this to happen is if your healers happen to get the healing buff from the Mistweaver Spirit mob, which will spawn from the green Pandaren crate. Obviously, the chance of this spawning is random, and you can't control that, but if you do happen to get the healing buff, it makes the fight quite a little bit more easier. It's substantially easier, actually, as you can use it to also kill off the adds that are around as well, and any other mobs that might be up. But you mainly want to focus on the sparks. Now, these sparks, when they land in your quadrant, they'll begin to cast an ability called Supernova, and you've got around 12 seconds to kill off the spark before Supernova goes off, and this ability cannot be interrupted. Once this goes off, it's pretty much a wipe, as it will deal a very high amount of damage to people that are close to the spark in that quadrant. So what you want to do is, as soon as the sparks spawn, maybe if you're expecting a group of 2 or 3 of them to spawn and you want to AoE them down, you want to start hitting them as soon as you possibly can. They only have about 1 million health, so it won't take you long to kill them off, but you do need to make sure that you're kind of splitting your damage between sparks and the rest of the mobs that are coming out of the boxes. It's probably better if you bring a ranged class that is strong at kind of split damage, such as your elemental shamans, because, you know, chain lightning lol, as they can focus mainly on the sparks and still do high amounts of damage to the other mobs that are up when they switch back to them. If your healers do happen to get a healing buff and can't kill off the sparks, well, I say kill them off, they deal around 700,000 damage to them, so your DPS will always need to hit them slightly. If your healers happen to miss some sparks that are up, then you need to let your DPS know, because they might be expecting you to hit those sparks, and if you don't, they won't DPS them as much as they might have done beforehand. Just make sure you let your DPS know with like 5 seconds remaining on the Supernova, because if it's like 2 seconds left, oh, by the way, you need to switch to this spark, the chances are it's going to blow up, as they're not going to switch to it in time in order to kill it off. So that's going to do it for this Mists of Pandaria raiding guide, and if you'd like to view a written version of this guide, you can either head on over to flaskup.com or click on the link in the video description below. Alternatively, if you'd like to view any of our other heroic mode raiding guides, then please do click on the annotations that are on screen now. As always, thank you for watching, and if you are interested in future Mists of Pandaria raiding guides, then please do subscribe to the channel.